One thing people bash on our religion about is its promotion of hatred, or potentially anyone that's different. Essentially being xenophobic. However, I have a feeling there's something almost inherent in human biology that hates things that are different. Some people might refer to it as the uncanny valley. There's something I'll have to delve into in terms of actual research after this video, but since I need to get some videos out soon, I'm recording this one now so I can get the research done afterwards. Sounds ridiculous, but I'm going to explain my point before I do the research to see if it countermands it. Therefore, you'll see me being honest and open and pointing out when I am wrong. So if at the end of my video it turns out I am wrong, I'm willing to concede that. I don't like wasting videos, especially at this stage. But where do I get my point that people seem to hate things that are different? Well, it's something that I've noticed quite a lot. People hate anything that is slightly different. It could be just a different way of doing things. It could be a different way of speaking. I personally struggle with accents, but that doesn't mean I hate them. No. After all, if that's the case, me and my wife, we would not be together, as I often struggle to understand her strong Nigerian accent. Another interesting one is, as I pointed out, the skin colour. People with subtly different skin colours, subtly different eye shades. Some people might say it's just us hating on individuals. And if the uncanny valley was that fine, one would say, hang on, why aren't siblings constantly killing each other? Or why aren't twins arch nemeses? That is a very good question. And I think that's where the line starts to blur. There's often a tribalism that turns up and ends up becoming focused. You could say religion promotes this tribalism, but that ends up going into the realm of propaganda, and that's something that religion is more than willing to step in on. I can't deny that. However, that is not always the case. There are several instances of either propaganda or just people hating on something and it expanding out of control. That does become the blame game, becomes the aspect of hating on people, becomes the aspect of tribalism or us against them. The two examples I can think of that are actually noteworthy and prevalent in recent years has to be Oriental phobia and renewed anti-Semitism. You may say, why renewed? Well, anti-Semitism may have cropped up throughout all manner of things and therefore may be sort of semi-culturally based. But that's not always the case. However, it particularly spiked during the height of the Israel-Palestine conflict, particularly with the rise of Hamas. Essentially, people started hating more on Jews, or anyone that seems to side with Jews. Even, interestingly enough, people who would normally never be seen as a target of this were targeted. Classic examples happen to be Stephen Fry, who mentioned that he had Jewish ancestry, or at least Jewish heritage, but also, as far as I can tell, happens to be no more Jewish than I'm Catholic. In fact, subtly less Jewish than I'm Catholic. Granted, my wife is Catholic, we go to a Catholic church, and we are thinking of raising our daughter Catholic. But those are subtly different circumstances. Furthermore, we don't force ourselves into this. I still identify as Anglican. My point being that people were just hating for the sake of hating, essentially. The second instance sprung up during the rise of COVID and the perpetuation of lockdown, especially during the advent of lockdown in Great Britain. This was Oriental phobia, or the hatred of the Chinese. It got to the point where, and I'm not joking, a Chris Peckham Appreciation Society was seemingly actively promoting anti-Oriental propaganda, seemingly strongly against the wishes of Chris Peckham himself. Some might argue because the Chinese commonly ate bat, and that meant they would end up potentially exposing themselves to viruses that could have led to COVID-19. This, unfortunately, would allow Chris Peckham to promote this sort of stuff, but I somehow doubt he would go as far as they did. And bear in mind, these people do not like getting called out. Because me and some mates tried calling out this person who seemed to be promoting this on the Chris Peckham Appreciation Society Facebook page, only for him to block us sequentially. Rather ridiculous, you ask us, especially since it was the admin that was doing the promotion, or at least allowing it to perpetuate. Strange enough, it seemed okay with me until I sent him a very particular clip that I always like keeping for those sort of moments. It's of a very particular character from Christopher Eccleston's run of Doctor Who, saying 5 words. You'd make a good Dalek. For those of you who don't know, the Daleks are genocidal and generally seem pleased with anything that would kill anything not Dalek. Some people might say they're a reference to religion. I'd say the Cybermen are a bit more like that, which I'm going to admit is more akin, as the Cybermen are more focused on conversion or upgrading. You see that these things will crop up without the aid of any religious fervour. Some people might say the Nazis definitely used anti-Semitic gospels to push their agenda, and others will point out that Hitler used church rhetoric. But anyone that actually looks into it knows Hitler himself was not at all Christian, and potentially was even anti-clerical. Just because you use church rhetoric does not mean that you yourself have to be of a church. Doesn't mean you yourself have to be supportive of the church. Especially when you bear in mind that the Nazi regime didn't really differentiate between Christians, Jews, or any other religion for that matter. Just to clarify, I'm saying that hatred does not have to stem from religion. It can do, but it's not necessary. Examples are given are Oriental phobia, increased Islamophobia, potentially increased anti-Semitism, and one could also say the Holocaust, or anything else that has people going against a religion without any religious backing themselves. Some people might say that religion is the perpetrator simply because it is the thing being targeted, but that becomes victim blaming, and if anyone is going to start shouting about victim blaming, it's going to be the atheists saying that religion always blames the victims. So I'm not entirely sure whether people will do that in this case. It's worthwhile remembering that though. So I think I've made my point. Whether it gets anywhere, whether it's going to be falling flat because of the research, I don't know. But I'll spend some time doing some research, present my findings, and I'll see where I get. I'm willing to eat my own words if I'm wrong. So let's see. It seems as though these bases of hating different is common in most groups. There are the psychological factors, but also the social and cultural factors. So whilst it does mention beliefs, it doesn't specifically mention religion, though we can't rule that out. Confirmation bias, deep held biases, collective hate, social environments, political rallies, cooling the energy. That tends to lead towards, it does indeed tend to lead towards propaganda. So again, we can't rule religion out for that. Interestingly enough, I'm going to look at the article from the Medium, but other things have cropped up, including, is religion the main cause of conflict? It does clearly say that conflicts may not be strictly rooted in religion, and instead may be a cover for underlying social power, secular power, ethnic, social, political, and economical reasons for conflict. That may be the case for many conflicts. Interesting enough, though, is religion used as an excuse for a war? Religion and warfare have historically been intertwined. Going back in history, as far as the written word, religion has often been claimed as a motive for war. But the reality of it is that religion is mostly used as a motivator, not a motive for conflict. So religion may be used to spur the propaganda, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only source. According to Stephen Survey, having been raised in religion, so we have to allow for a minor bit of bias here. He was taught about the charitable aspects, helping others, especially the poor, the sick, and the disabled. Sure, some of these teachings, looking back, were bigoted and hypocritical, but never were they advocating violence. When I became older, I met people who were Buddhists, and I learned that they too held similar views and espoused a life of peace, love, and charity. So as a child and adolescent, religion to me was, to sum up, love, peace, charity, and living in harmony. It's worthwhile noting he did alter his views slightly as he grew up. Some religions, or with some religious people, there's a caveat to what I had always thought. That caveat is that their religion is one of peace, love, charity, and harmony, only if everyone believes as they do. Harbouring slightly different beliefs or cultures or lifestyles then not only becomes unacceptable but dangerous. That can be seen as a broad area of religion being involved. To continue, if anyone seriously studies histories, they will learn that there are a multitude of wars fought over religion, ideologies, politics, or land. Some people say they have died in religious wars. Some people say that more people have died in religious wars than any other type of war. According to Book Rate, approximately 809 million people have died in religious wars, while 209 million have died in non-religious ones.
It's going on to show all the others. I made the summarise a moment. I'm willing to concede that this gentleman has indeed gone over his assumptions, and by the looks of it, I'll leave a link to this article in the description of this video. He seems to have come around to the idea that religion does indeed support a great deal of wars. By introducing this, just as alcohol, guns, and automobiles themselves are not dangerous, they do become dangerous when they're in the hands of mentally unstable or people with nefarious intent. Religion, as a belief in a higher being and a belief that we should love and care for our fellow man, is a beautiful concept. But when people with ulterior motives, suffering from mental disease and extreme hatred and bigotry, are allowed to take over religion and run amok, that religion must be held accountable and must exert control or punishment on its members. This is him highlighting the fact that religion has been used. Not that it naturally sticks out, though it is fair to accept that religion in this case does carry a strong role. I feel obliged to mention that the term true religion is a bit of a narrow field, since the concept of God is so broad and nebulous that, as many people notice, many sects in their own religions crop up. So we cannot always guarantee that one religion is truly correct. Hence my general belief that religion as a whole is a study of God and an understanding of him through as many lenses as possible. No point smashing the ones that we already have. I asked, has religion been responsible for hate propaganda? Unfortunately, the answer seems pretty broad, and generally I'm going to sift through several articles, but I may as well look at the quick hits here, such as what hatred based on religion is called. What is hatred based on religion called? Religious discrimination. That is generally, though, that can be considered racism or discrimination purely because of someone's belief. So not necessarily by a religious person, can also be by secular and atheist peoples. Accepting that there are people who in religion who do hate on other religions, we have to allow for all areas, but that does not rule out atheism in this case. How does religion often create conflict? Sectarian violence involves differences based on interpretations of religious doctrine or practice. This is simply the conflict thesis going on primarily between different sects, but that's generally how things evolve and separate, and that is often done in all manner of areas. You see that in charity splitting, you see that in nations dividing, you see that in ideologies and empires forming. You'll find that in all manner of areas. Religion is not the only area that has that. So with the classic schisms and the Catholic and Orthodox churches, the Protestant church, and later the Baptist movements, it all rises and falls. These are classic examples. What was the definition of religious propaganda? Often used to influence opinions and beliefs on religious issues, particularly during the split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, or during the Crusades. That's nothing unusual, unfortunately. I'm going to go into the most description of religions, so that's something completely different. But interestingly enough, has hate speech directed at one community affect another? That's very much communities, and whilst communities kind of religious area, that does not necessarily include religion as the only source. Blasphemy against religions are not particularly interested in that. It's because of religious belief or original belief. That can go either way. Hate speech and incitement to hatred or violence. There's basically a lot going on. Though I generally wonder whether the religious hate crime is an interesting one to look at, particularly as that looks like. Yes, that looks like the time that Stephen Fry mentioned he was Jewish. Here's some interesting figures. This is primarily due to Israel-Hamas conflict. Over 140,000 hate crime offences were recorded during 2024, late 2024. Anti-Semitic crimes more than doubled, whilst Islamophobic crimes were up 13%. Considering that Islamophobia was on the rise quite a bit, and certainly thanks to Britain's First, a far-right group, this did not help very much with what people were doing. I'm interested to do some research into Britain's First, and I'm pretty sure I'll find a lot of Christian rhetoric there. Now, going over all this, it's generally believed to be the woke crowd, certainly by those who are targeting Stephen Fry and other famous Jews, including David Baddiel. I have a strong feeling that the religion is not necessarily the motivator, though some might say it is the focal point. That's a different, though this is a different angle. This seems to be going over all the figures for all sorts of hate crime. Disability hate crimes down 18%, sexual orientation down 8%, 2% for transgender hate crimes. So in general, it doesn't look like there's a great deal of change in those figures. Though, interestingly enough, in order to back this up, I just had to check what was the general religious views of people at the time. Fortunately, there was a census in 2021 where it was showed that religion had dropped quite notably. Most people were identifying, well, the majority were still identifying as Christian, that being around 46%, around 37% were identifying as no religion, marking the second most common. So whether it is entirely down to the religious population targeting the Jews, Muslims and other people that were being targeted for hate crimes is hard to tell. Going over the census introduced the voluntary question. Practice. As the question is voluntary, be cautious when comparing figures between different areas or between censuses because of the varying response rates. So even then, we can't really pin it down, but we can naturally assume that if people were not marking the box. Oh, hello, here we are. In total, 94% of the overall population of England and Wales chose to answer the religion question. There's a high percentage in 2011 where where 7% chose not to answer. Interesting, that does not help my search, but it does show the difficulty in analysing this. The fact that in, let's see, the blue is 2021, the grey is 2011. Well, there's a minor increase in other religions, such as in Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and Sikhism, and even the broader other. It does not help me pin down the change in religion. So whether this has anything to do with the increase in the hate crime, it's difficult to tell. Since I mentioned the woke, I decided to double check if people actually started to identify as woke. So started looking around, but there's no definite statistics, though only around 16% claim to identify as woke, and that was back in 2022. And even then, that entirely depends on how you define woke, which is a very open-ended thing, and some people didn't even know what it meant. About 44% didn't know that. So this is a much harder thing to find. But interesting, what percentage of the UK is woke? Let's double check. Yeah, again, slight increase from 12%. Seeing though woke is far more of a culture wars. That'll be interesting. I'll see if I can look into that. But seeing though woke is far more of a label other people give people than people claim themselves. So it's much harder to pin down in regards to who is actually woke and whether that is the source of hate crime. Note, I am not saying, make sure you don't cut that out of context, make sure you understand that I'm not saying woke is causing hate crimes. I'm just noting that some people in the woke community may as well have been part of the hate crimes, particularly against those supporting Hamas. Since I saw the culture wars, I decided to check if they were religiously motivated and just got a bunch of drivel. But the main issue of the culture wars, the hot buttons such as abortion, gun politics, separating of church and state, privacy, recreational drug use, homosexuality, censorship. So the culture wars are primarily polarizing, so we can't really use that. I thought that was really interesting that some people say that division was primarily driven by religion, and some say it was primarily made by political powers. So realistically, that is a complete waste of a search. Now, if we say who at the moment the culture was, that's a band, so there's no point looking into that. Most cultural nihilism, suppose essential. There's modern Muslim world. Different from the nihilism rejects distinct aspects of existence, just harmony and knowledge. And that's just going to what nihilism is, so we can't really go with that. Identity politics. Suppose that could be considered that, though again I'll have to double check with Britons First, who were very much the people who wanted to go with this idea of the Leave campaign long before David Cameron ever took to the idea to the polls. So it's worthwhile checking that. Do I have anything else? Is woke identity politics? That's just a random turn of phrase that doesn't make much sense. And what's the opposite of woke? Anti-wokeness, traditionalist, anti-woke. Denial of systematic justice. That's interesting. It seems to be based around the idea of just that woke is primarily looking at things going wrong within systems, or at least attacking systems that are definitely targeting people. And whilst that is the case in many instances, we cannot pin that down to purely systematics who have links to religion. No word for woke, enlightened, aware, conscious, progressive, sense of social injustice. That's basically just being a good person. That's what I consider woke to mean, so if there's anything more to that, I honestly don't know. It seems as though the main leaders of the Britons First were indeed Christian, apparently going for evangelical Protestantism. And whilst I might say they are very much fundamentalist, and possibly even Trump-related, this unfortunately does not hide the moniker of religious. So I had to accept that in general, this seems to be a religious campaign. Though it did lose a great deal of its overtly religious aspects when Jada Fanstian and Paul Golding departed. They did end up still maintaining some strong Christian foundation, including maintaining and strengthening Christianity as the foundation of our society and culture. Seems as though it drifted into the White Lives Matter idea, which didn't help a great deal. And whether or not we can link that to fundamentalism, we honestly don't know. But given the fact that they don't have much understanding of their recent past, apparently Jada Fanstian herself being only a third-generation British, her father being, I think it was her grandfather, being a Dutch immigrant, that doesn't help us find a fixation on Britain being purely a religious state that helps others. It seems as though they're just by themselves and fall into the old fundamentalist ways. However, that can't excuse the religious aspect of this, and I can't deny that. Since Britain's first had a strong Christian link, I decided to go for their main political party who were interested in running the country at the time, UKIP, headed by Nigel Farage. Interestingly enough, though, he does not have any specific affiliation, but he does identify as nominal Christian, or Christian in the cultural sense. However, that also includes such people as my good friend Andy, and also, interesting enough, Richard Dawkins, yes, who identifies as culturally Christian, they're not religiously Christian. That does not in any way or form back up any religious hatred towards anything else. I would hesitate to call Nigel Farage a racist in this case, but he's very much anti-immigration, anti-foreign policy. So, whilst I refuse to go political on this channel, I have a very strong feeling that if Britain was any other culture, he would stick with that one primarily, not affiliating with any particular religious group. And I decided to ask the big question, is propaganda religious in origin? Hate propaganda primarily. It seems as though it generally passes over all things, including culture, identity factors, any individual groups, based on ethnicity, religion, nationality, race, colour, descent, gender. So ultimately, it seems as though it doesn't matter who is starting it, provided the hate aspect is the one that stands out. You want to make it religion, you want to make it hate propaganda. The race and hate religion. Since religions are not racist, that's a bit of a broader term. I'm not going to go into which is it. Religious hate propaganda that originates with political authorities. That's an interesting one. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Hatred on the basis of religion or belief. This seems to be primarily, well, religion at the target of the hatred. So this doesn't seem to operate in the same vein. I think more detailed searches are needed. But interest now is reaching the area of double standards. It does come across the section regarding, let's see, what was it? Homosexuality. Yes, so in the Bible, advocating against it. Interestingly enough, it's worthwhile noting that whilst the Bible can be used to argue against, or at least promote hate against certain groups, particularly those of notable ones such as homosexuality, and potentially even other religions, it is not, however, promoting it directly. It seems to be more focused on such individuals or even mentioning ideas that they had at the time. So it's entirely down to interpretation. Therefore, we cannot, in any way, shape or form, put the blame on the religious text, certainly not in the case of Christianity. I can't judge by any other religious text, though it seems as though some may have other situations of that sort. Like I said, all of this will be in links in the description. This is an interesting one, religious hate propaganda, which is sustained communication by an authority that attempts to guide an audience towards persecuting others based on their religion, is speech crime. Now, you get on the rest of it, you'll see that it's primarily focused on throwing hate towards religion. So I'm not entirely sure whether it helps in this case. I'm going to go down the abstract. Dangerous accusations portray the other as capable of mystical harm, and when made by cultural authorities become socially accepted truths if repeated during rituals or rituals of verdiction. I'm not going to read in this case. This article shows that the dangerous accusations are the heart of religious hate propaganda, and exploit cognitive bias of the threat perception, coalitional psychology, and costly signaling. Moreover, dangerous accusations can reinforce the social order and maintain social cohesion. Together, the analysis of speech crimes and dangerous accusations shed light on how religious hate propaganda works, and often mean to religious communities, and how it can justify persecution in certain environments. It seems to be, by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to be going over the general idea of propaganda in both religious circles and against religion, so it's tricky to manage as a whole. But I would say it's, in summary, saying there are aspects of hate crime or hate related propaganda in religion, but it's generally down to misunderstandings, which unfortunately falls back on my constant repetition of education is key. Do not ignore education as a factor in this. What's not necessarily the same thing, the uncanny valley hypothesis, is something I was interested in. So let's take a look. It seems as though they mainly focus on the hypothesis, very difficulty perceptible discrimination between categorically ambiguous humans and human-like characteristics, human-like characters. Interesting. It seems as though they focus primarily on the human aspect a great deal. I go right down to the graph they show. A healthy person. Now, whilst there's going to be a big difference between a human likeness corpse and zombie compared to a healthy human, I wonder whether it is, let me see with the pencil, if this is the point at which we start to see the potential drop in likeness compared to other things. What if the uncanny valley of racism starts just below here? Something like that. Honestly, there isn't really anything to... Whoops. There doesn't seem to be anything that links to that. But I would hazard a guess, just based on the familiarity scale, that an average human of our culture will be right at the top there, but an average human not of our culture will be slightly lower. Maybe not exactly in the uncanny valley, but close enough, particularly in that dip, to make one think this is not quite the same. It's worthwhile noting, just taking note of the prosthetic hand comment there, the such thing as a, what was it, phantom limb or dissociated body part, where some people think their arm is not their own or something akin to that. So for all we know, these things are going to be different. Potentially, if someone just perceives it as different to them or not of them, and that could be very much a psychological thing rather than a cultural, even a propaganda thing. This could lead to the hypothesis that the uncanny valley does link to racism. This is an interesting one from the International Journal of Human Computer Statistics, or something like that. Was it? Maybe. The other race effect in the uncanny valley. It seems to be linked to my understanding. Just going by the abstract, which is basically the summary of it, the uncanny valley stands for the feeling of eeriness triggered by something that looks almost but not exactly like a real human, potentially like us. If I go down, we get to, here we are. These differences can be attributed to unequal exposure to the faces from different races within each culture, thus demonstrating the other race bias in the uncanny valley. This is interesting. It could also explain why people who have subtly different bodies and so forth could be seen as unnatural, weird, or just different. By all means, take a look at the rest of the study. I'm literally just reading the abstract. But it does tend to suggest the uncanny valley is strongly linked to an other race bias, as they're putting it, as you can see here, other race bias. Obviously, the cure for that is exposure to other cultures, but then again, that's generally the cure to racism as well, exposed to many cultures over the years rather than just stick to your own. You do find those that tend to be racist also tend to be the most isolated. Not always the case, but you generally get the idea. The rest can be linked to propaganda. But that is a completely separate issue.
This is the next day, I've done the research, and it seems as though, whilst the uncanny valley does have a strong part to play in the differences aspect, the propaganda aspect does appear to have a religious link. Not exclusively religious, that we can't deny, but there is a link to it. So I think, whilst my hypothesis regarding uncanny valley is sound, we have to allow for the religious aspect. Unfortunately, it's going to spring up in many cases, especially when it comes to hate propaganda.
It's worthwhile noting the role that scripture can have in hate propaganda. However, it seems as though whilst some people have, it is not the primary use of scripture in this case. It seems as though many of those that have used it are not particularly savoury people. And many people who talk about it will say that the Bible does not, in and of itself, promote hatred. Those of you who are interested in raising the objection that Romans 1 definitely mentions and condemns homosexuality in no uncertain terms, I might simply say, look at the context surrounding it and understand why. Since they're literally just given this passage and not even one of the full lines, we end up with a situation where we're simply seeing something, not being given God's view of it. Since every single line afterwards technically talking about how people examines it, and how that some people say that it's not for them to interpret it, we end up in a situation where we can easily take that out of context and simply say that the Bible can promote hate. But that is often the case with interpretation and taking things out of context. The second you do that, you fall into a trap. As we can see, there are even terms to explain why, or at least to explain where, scripture is taken out of context. We have exegesis, and we have proof texting. The truth is that any verse by itself can be taken out of context and used to suit someone's purpose, and has been for hundreds of years. I think ultimately, if taken out of context, we lose its original meaning. So we can't really use the Bible as hate propaganda unless we do take it out of context, to understand why and even what it means back then.
So I think we can say that that uncanny valley is the source of hate and potentially a racist aspect, but religion and other forms of propaganda will push that into action. And that can very much depend either on the specific scriptures focused or the people spouting that propaganda. So as religion does have a part to play, it is not the only aspect that triggers wars fueled by hatred. So I'm going to say, based on all this, that it's somewhat inconclusive. because my hypothesis regarding the Uncanny Valley holds a lot of truth. But to say that humans are inherently racist is going to be a tricky one to stick. And we also lack a great deal of corroborating evidence to back this up. Now, some of you might look at the research I did and say that I was correct, or say that I'm completely wrong and then do other research to back up your own areas, and I think that is going to be the confirmation bias thing ringing out. So by all means, do your research, try to keep an objective mind, and remember that what we find, if it's what we want to find, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the truth. So always keep an open mind. I mean, I didn't want the religious aspect of the propaganda to be true, and yet I find a great deal of it being heavily hinted at, to the point many might say that it's true. And yet my Uncanny Valley theory holds a lot of water. Maybe demonstrated most of all in the film Pocahontas, where they used skin, they used culture, they used all manner of things that are alien to point out how people are different, and therefore name them savages. It has demonstrated to you guys that I don't just rattle off things off the top of my head. I do the research when I can. And if I find a hypothesis that sticks, but much of it doesn't hold enough water to call it conclusive, I will say so. Am I a totally reliable source? No. There's bound to be other people who dedicate their lives to this, who do far more research, who spend hours, days, weeks, even months doing their research, whereas I've done a few hours, if that. And hopefully you'll see that I do not use my own religious biases as the basis for all of my studies. I try to cover things from all angles, if at all possible. No matter how different, no matter how weird. So I hope that reassures you. I hope that you see that this research has led to something, at least giving you an interesting avenue to look into yourselves. So good luck with that. Enjoy yourselves. Stay humble, stay safe, and God be with you, my friends.